The ER staff at Rainier Harbor Medical Center thought she was too quiet. Some called her soft. Others ignored her completely. They mocked the way she spoke gently, the way she never raised her voice, and the way she stayed calm while others panicked. For months, Emma Collins worked the hardest shifts and took blame for mistakes that weren't hers. They thought she didn't matter. They thought the man who arrived with a German Shepherd was just another tired veteran. They thought the dog was just a dog. But when a stormy night turned the hospital into a Navy SEAL operation, the laughter stopped. Because they weren't standing next to ordinary people, they were standing next to quiet heroes, and a miracle that refused to stay silent. Subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and second chances. Rain stitched Seattle together in thin silver threads, blurring streetlights, softening sirens, and pressing a damp hush over Rainier Harbor Medical Center, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Ethan Carter arrived without announcing himself, which was how he preferred to move through the world now. He was 37, tall, in a way that came from posture rather than pride. Shoulders squared by years of carrying weight that had never been his alone. His face was carved with hard angles, cheekbones sharp beneath a short, untrimmed beard the color of wet ash. A thin scar traced the edge of his jaw, half hidden unless the light struck just right. His eyes, steel gray, restless, never stopped measuring distances, exits, reflections in glass. War had taught them that stillness was a lie. At his left heel walked Rex, a 4-year-old German Shepherd with a deep sable coat darkened by rain, ears alert and symmetrical like they'd been measured with intent. Rex moved with disciplined fluidity, muscles lean and ready beneath his fur-amber eyes, scanning the hospital entrance with a seriousness that unsettled people who expected dogs to wag first and think later. There was a faint limp in his rear leg, subtle enough to miss unless you knew how to look. Ethan knew. He'd felt it every step for the past 3 weeks. Inside the emergency department, the air smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed with the kind of impatience that wore down tempers. Emma Collins stood at the triage desk, posture straight despite the 12-hour shift dragging at her shoulders. She was 32, medium height, slim but not fragile, with chestnut brown hair pulled into a practical bun that never quite held through the night. Her skin was pale, lightly freckled, the kind that bruised easily and remembered stress. Her eyes, soft green, observant, missed very little, though people often mistook her quiet for weakness. Emma had learned silence young. Growing up in Spokane with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who drank away his apologies, she discovered early that listening kept the peace. Nursing hadn't cured that instinct, but it had sharpened it. She watched hands breathing patterns the way people stood when they lied. Compassion to her was not loud, it was precise. "Pets aren't allowed past intake," Dr. Ryan Mercer said from behind her, his voice smooth with practiced authority. Mercer was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, meticulously groomed, with dark hair that never dared disobey him, and a smile that surfaced only when he was winning. He wore confidence like armor and competence like a badge, though the two were not always the same thing. Years earlier, a malpractice scare he'd narrowly escaped had taught him a single lesson: never look uncertain. "He's not a pet," Ethan said calmly, his voice low and even shaped by commands once shouted over rotor wash and gunfire. "He's injured." Rex sat on command, back straight, eyes fixed forward. Emma noticed the discipline immediately, the way the dog checked in with Ethan through the smallest flick of his ear. Her gaze dropped to Rex's hind leg, to the subtle stiffness in the joint, the way his weight shifted to compensate. "What happened?" she asked, ignoring Mercer's sigh. Ethan hesitated a fraction too long. "Metal," he said. "Old." Emma nodded. She didn't press. She'd learned that some answers arrived only when invited. "Let's get you into exam 3, she said, already moving. As they walked, whispers followed. A nurse near the supply cart muttered something about another guy who thinks rules don't apply. Someone else laughed quietly. Ethan heard it all. He always did. Rex did too. His ears twitched, but he stayed calm, a professional, in a place that underestimated him. In exam 3, Emma knelt to Rex's level, her movements careful, respectful. "You're a good boy," she murmured, not in the sing-song tone people used for comfort, but as a statement of fact. Rex met her eyes assessing, then allowed her touch. Ethan watched her hands. They were steady. That mattered. He hadn't trusted many people since a mission in Kandahar had gone sideways, since he'd learned how quickly confidence could turn lethal. That night had taken 2 men he loved and left him with a silence that never quite lifted. Rex had been there then, too, younger, faster, dragging Ethan behind cover when his leg refused to cooperate. Loyalty like that rewired a man. "Name?" Emma asked, glancing up. "Ethan," he said. "Dog's Rex." She smiled faintly. "I'm Emma." For a moment the rain outside grew heavier, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Somewhere deeper in the hospital a siren wailed closer, urgent, unaware that 3 lives, 1 quiet nurse, 1 tired soldier, 1 watchful dog had just brushed against each other in a way that would soon matter more than any of them could imagine. Ethan rested a hand on Rex's head, grounding himself in the familiar warmth. He had come for a simple thing, help for his partner. He did not yet know that Seattle had other plans, or that some storms waited until you thought you were safe before they spoke. The X-ray room hummed softly, a low mechanical murmur that reminded Ethan Carter uncomfortably of generators idling before night operations. Rex lay on the stainless table without being told, his long frame, still chest rising in controlled breaths. The dog's amber eyes never left Ethan's face, tracking micro-expressions the way he once tracked hand signals in dust and smoke. The limp was more pronounced now that Rex was still. The right hind leg twitched faintly, betraying pain. Discipline couldn't fully mask. Emma Collins stood at the light board studying the image as it bloomed onto the screen. The shadow was unmistakable, an irregular sliver lodged deep near the muscle, old enough that tissue had begun to accept it, dangerous enough that removal would require precision. Her jaw tightened, not in fear, but in quiet frustration. This wasn't a simple injury, and she knew exactly how Dr. Ryan Mercer would react. Mercer entered like a man stepping onto a stage built for him. He was freshly caffeinated white coat, immaculate dark brows drawn together in performative concern. His gaze flicked to the screen, then to Rex, lingering a beat too long on the animal, as if deciding whether the effort was worth his time. "That's shrapnel," he said flatly. "Military grade by the look of it." His eyes slid to Ethan. "You want to tell me how a civilian dog ends up with that?" Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the reflexive urge to retreat behind half-truths. Years ago in Helmand Province, a delay like this would have meant bleeding out in the sand. He rested a hand on Rex's neck, fingers pressing lightly into warm fur. "It happened overseas," he said. "We were extracting civilians. He took a hit meant for me." Mercer scoffed. "Hero dog, then." The word hero came out thin, sarcastic. "Surgery isn't without risk. Infection, nerve damage. And frankly, we're short-staffed. Human casualties take priority." Emma turned from the screen, meeting Mercer's eyes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "The fragment is migrating," she said. "If it shifts another centimeter, it'll tear muscle fibers permanently. He'll lose the leg." Mercer hesitated. Not because he doubted her assessment, but because he hated being corrected in front of others. That hesitation, the half-second where ego fought judgment, was something Emma recognized too well. It was the same pause she'd seen in her father before he decided not to come home sober. "I'll put in a consult," Mercer said, finally, already backing toward the door. "No promises." When he left the room, felt lighter. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Thank you," he said, meaning more than the words covered. Emma shrugged a small human gesture. "He did his job," she replied, glancing at Rex. "So did you." Before Ethan could answer, the floor vibrated, not sharply, but enough to register. Rex's ears snapped forward, muscles tensing. His head turned toward the hallway, nostrils flaring. It wasn't a sound, it was a pressure, something felt through bone rather than heard. Ethan's spine straightened. "That wasn't an ambulance," he murmured. The overhead speakers crackled, then went silent. Down the hall, a man in a security uniform broke into a jog. He was young, barely mid-20s, with a buzz cut and the jittery posture of someone still learning authority. "We've got incoming," he said breathlessly to no one in particular. "Ferry incident. Multiple casualties." The ER exploded into motion. Gurneys rolled. Curtains snapped open. The sterile calm fractured into controlled chaos. Emma moved automatically, fingers flying over charts, voice steady as she reassigned tasks. She caught sight of another nurse joining the floor, Sarah Whitman, late 30s, tall and angular with sun-blonde hair, cut blunt at the shoulders. Sarah had the kind of confidence that came from surviving something ugly. A car accident years back had left a faint scar along her collarbone and a temper she kept tightly leashed. She met Emma's eyes and nodded once. No words needed. Ethan stepped back instinctively, making himself small, invisible. Rex didn't. The dog's gaze locked onto the automatic doors just as they burst open. Paramedics rushed in with the first wave, burns, fractures, blood everywhere. Then came a stretcher flanked by two men who didn't move like civilians. Both were broad-shouldered, close-cropped, wearing civilian jackets that couldn't hide the way they scanned corners. One had a jagged cut above his brow, blood drying black against his skin. "This one's priority," the taller man barked. His voice carried command without asking permission. "We need a secure bay." Mercer reappeared, energized, now chest-puffed. "All patients are treated equally here," he snapped. "You'll wait your turn." The patient on the stretcher groaned, a sound cut short by labored breathing. Rex growled low, not aggressive but urgent. Ethan's eyes tracked the man's chest, the uneven rise, the way the neck veins stood out against pale skin. His pulse quickened. He knew that pattern. He'd seen it under worse skies. Emma saw it too. Her hand stilled on the chart. His airway she began, but Mercer waved her off. "Focus on your assignment, Emma," he said. "I've got this." That was when Rex broke protocol. He stood placing his body between the stretcher and Mercer hackles, lifting just enough to command attention. The room froze. Security hands went to radios. Ethan moved without thinking, voice firm. "Rex down." The dog obeyed instantly, but not before making his point. Mercer flushed. "Get that animal out of here," he said. Ethan didn't argue. He looked at Emma instead. In his eyes was something she recognized instantly, not desperation, but calculation. The look of a man who knew time was being wasted. "If you wait," he said quietly, "he dies." The words landed like a dropped tray, sharp, unavoidable. Emma felt the floor tilt under her feet, the weight of choice pressing down. She thought of Rex on the table of shrapnel, buried and ignored. She thought of all the times she'd followed rules that led nowhere. Outside, sirens layered over one another, a rising tide. Inside, something fragile was forming a line that once crossed could not be uncrossed. Emma drew a breath, feeling the room watching her. She stepped forward. "Clear Trauma Bay 2, she said. Mercer stared at her, stunned. "That's not your call." Emma met his gaze, heart-pounding, voice steady. "It is if we want him alive." Ethan felt it then, the shift. The moment before everything changes. Rex's tail thumped once against the floor, a quiet, approving beat, as the doors to Trauma Bay 2 slid open and the night rushed in after them. Trauma Bay 2 smelled of iodine and rain-soaked wool as the doors sealed behind them, muting the din of the ER into a distant, impatient roar. The patient was transferred in a rush, male, early 40s, tall, even supine, with a broad chest that rose unevenly beneath a soot-stained jacket. His hair was dark and clipped close to the scalp, his beard trimmed to regulation neatness. Jaw clenched in a way that suggested discipline was a habit, not a costume. A faint tremor shook his hands as oxygen was fitted, adrenaline doing its treacherous work. Ethan clocked the details instantly. Paradoxical breathing, distended neck veins, the pallor that came from pressure building where it shouldn't. He knew the look because he'd worn it once, bleeding quietly in a place where help came late, or not at all. Emma moved with practiced economy, snapping gloves, calling vitals, her voice level but tight at the edges. Sarah Whitman took the airway side without being asked. long fingers steady despite the controlled chaos, her angular face set in a focus that had been forged the day a drunk driver folded her car like paper and taught her how quickly life could pivot. Dr. Mercer burst in last, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with the dangerous blend of authority and fear. "I'm lead," he announced, planting himself at the patient's flank. "Prep for intubation." The two men who'd escorted the stretcher lingered at the threshold. Tension coiled in their shoulders. One of them, shorter, stockier, with crow's feet etched deep from sun and squinting, kept his gaze on the monitors as if they were a battlefield map. "He can't lie flat," he said, voice roughened by smoke and habit. Mercer ignored him. Rex lay just inside the bay, head down, eyes up, every muscle a quiet question. The dog's sable coat bristled when the patient's oxygen saturation dipped again, a soft, urgent sound rumbling in his chest. Ethan stepped closer, not touching, just present the way you stood near a door that might be kicked in. Mercer went for the laryngoscope. His angle was wrong. Ethan saw it before the blade touched. Emma saw it too. She felt the old reflex to defer, to soften, rear up, then she pushed it down. "Doctor," she said, "careful but firm, his trachea's deviating. We should decompress first." Mercer shot her a look that could curdle milk. "We don't take orders from triage," he snapped, adjusting his grip. The patient gagged, chest heaving, numbers sliding south. Sarah glanced up, jaw set. "She's right," she said quietly, a woman who'd learned when to spend her voice. The stockier escort swore under his breath. "If you miss Mercer," cut him off with a glare. "Security," he barked toward the hall. "Get these civilians out." Rex rose to a sit posture, perfect eyes locked on Mercer's hands. Ethan's heart thudded, the old rhythm waking. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't have to. "Doctor," he said evenly, "you're about to make it worse." For half a second Mercer hesitated. Ego and math wrestled. That pause was all the patient's body could spare. Oxygen plummeted. The monitor screamed. Emma felt the room tilt and then settle into a terrible clarity. She stepped in, already pulling the tray closer, fingers finding the needle she needed without looking. "Clear," she said, voice cutting through noise like a blade. Mercer sputtered, but Sarah was already shifting, making space. Ethan moved to the patient's shoulders, anchoring him, his hands firm and calm, the way you held someone steady when the world shook. Rex pressed his chest to Ethan's shin, grounding both of them. Emma found the landmark by touch, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular, her breath. A metronome. She drove the needle in with decisive care. There was a hiss, sharp and unmistakable, the sound of a room exhaling. The patient's chest eased, numbers climbing back from the brink. Silence fell in a stunned wave. Emma secured the catheter, eyes flicking to the monitor, then to Mercer. "Chest tube next," she said, not unkindly, not apologizing. Mercer's face drained of color. "You," he began, but the words tangled. The taller escort stepped forward, relief and something like awe flickering across his features. "Thank you," he said to Emma, then to Ethan, nodding once with the gravity of men who measured gratitude carefully. Security arrived late, uncertain radios crackling. Mercer straightened, salvaging authority. "She acted without authorization," he said, pointing. "This will be documented." Emma met his gaze, heart still racing, but her voice was steady. "Document the vitals," she replied. "They're improving." Sarah let out a breath she'd been holding since the doors closed, her shoulders dropping a fraction. Rex lay back down, crisis past, tail thumping once satisfied. They wheeled the patient toward imaging stability, fragile but real. As they moved, a new figure appeared at the bay doors, a woman in a tailored raincoat, mid-40s, dark hair streaked with silver pulled into a severe knot. Her skin was olive, her eyes sharp and assessing, the kind that weighed rooms and found weak seams. She wore no badge, but authority followed her like a shadow. "I'm Deputy Director Laura Bennett," she said calmly, to no one and everyone. "Who's in charge here?" Mercer opened his mouth. Bennett's gaze slid past him to Emma, to Ethan, to Rex. "We'll talk," she said, already deciding. In the corridor, voices rose and fell, rumors sprinting ahead of facts. Mercer leaned in close to Emma, words tight and venomous. "You just crossed a line," he whispered. Emma felt fear flare, then settle into something harder. "So did you," she said softly. Ethan watched it all, cataloging outcomes. He had come for Rex. He had not planned to be seen. Yet the bay doors had refused to close on the truth. Some moments demanded action, and once taken, they changed the shape of what came next. As the gurney disappeared, Deputy Director Bennett turned her eyes lingering on Rex's disciplined stillness. Somewhere above them, rain drummed harder, as if the city itself were listening, waiting to see who would claim the storm. The corridor outside Trauma Bay 2 felt narrower than it had minutes before, as if walls could sense when choices hardened into consequences. Deputy Director Laura Bennett stood just off the main flow, raincoat darkened at the cuffs, posture straight and economical. Up close, she looked lean and spare, mid-40s with fine lines etched by long hours and longer decisions, olive skin unadorned by makeup eyes, a cool slate that weighed rooms the way accountants weighed ledgers. She spoke softly, forcing others to lean in. "I want a timeline," she said, gaze moving from Emma to Sarah to Dr. Mercer, pausing last on Ethan and the sable dog at his side. "And I want it clean." Mercer started first, words polished and defensive, framing Emma's action as reckless improvisation. As he spoke, his shoulders squared, chin lifted, the stance of a man used to winning arguments by volume and credentials. Laura listened without interruption, hands folded, head tilted a fraction. When Mercer finished, she turned to Emma. "Your account." Emma felt the familiar flutter in her chest and anchored herself by naming facts, not feelings. She described vitals, the visible tracheal shift, the failed angle, the drop in oxygen the moment time ran out. Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. Sarah nodded once, in confirmation. Blonde hair catching the fluorescent light, angular features, calm the scar along her collarbone, a pale parenthesis to a story she rarely told. Ethan said little, offering only the observation that waiting would have killed the patient. Rex lay sphinx still at Ethan's boot, ears pricked, amber eyes flicking between speakers like a metronome. Laura considered the dog for a beat longer than necessary. "Name?" she asked. "Rex," Ethan said. "Age 4. Laura nodded, then shifted her focus back to Mercer. "Your decision to intubate without decompression contradicts the signs described," she said. "Explain." Mercer bristled. He reached for language like a SHIELD protocol's staffing chain of command. Laura let him finish, then wrote a single line in a small notebook with a pen that scratched softly, decisively. "Chain of command exists to save lives," she said, "not faces." She closed the notebook. "I'm ordering a peer review. Effective immediately, you're relieved of lead duties for the remainder of this shift." The words landed without ceremony. Mercer's face tightened, a flush creeping up his neck. "You can't." "I can," Laura said, already turning. And I did. In the imaging suite, the patient, now stabilized, was transferred with quiet efficiency. The escorts hovered less aggressively, tension easing into guarded relief. One of them finally introduced himself as Mark Hale, early 40s, broad and compact, a former Marine whose shoulders carried the squared look of someone who slept light and moved first. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried the gravel of hard places. "You bought him time," he said to Emma, nodding with restrained respect. Time, Emma thought, was a currency. Hospitals spent recklessly. As the immediate crisis ebbed, the secondary ones surfaced. Security logs were pulled, cameras reviewed. Laura requested records from the ferry incident, times, manifests, names that weren't names. She moved through the department like a current, redirecting without splashing. Ethan watched, recognizing the cadence of command that didn't announce itself. He kept to the margins, a habit he'd cultivated after a night in Kandahar where being seen had cost lives. Rex tracked Laura's movement with interest. Not suspicion, an evaluation that mattered more to Ethan than any badge. Near the supply alcove, Laura stopped. "Your dog was injured," she said to Ethan. "X-ray shows retained metal." Yes, I can expedite surgery, she offered. It wasn't kindness, it was leverage. Ethan considered the floor. I don't want favors. Laura's mouth curved slightly. Neither do I. I want clarity. She glanced toward the bay where Mercer stood, arms folded, simmering. We don't always get it from charts. They found it instead in a small detail, a medication cart that had been stocked twice, signatures overlapping where they shouldn't. Sarah noticed it first, fingers pausing over a vial. This was logged by someone who wasn't here, she said. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes sharpened. Laura's pen scratched again. By the time Rex was wheeled toward pre-op, the hospital's hum had changed pitch. Rumors moved slower now, wary. Emma walked beside the gurney, one hand resting lightly on Rex's shoulder, feeling the warmth under the fur, the steady courage that had pulled her through a line she'd crossed knowingly. Ethan matched her stride, silent gratitude radiating in the small ways, holding doors, reading her pace, not asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. Outside the OR doors, Laura stopped them. Ethan Carter, she said, tasting the name. You didn't volunteer much. I wasn't asked, he replied. She studied his face, the scar at the jaw, the beard cut close, the eyes that mapped exits by instinct. Something happened, she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't deny it. It usually does. Laura nodded, satisfied. After surgery, I'll want a word. Rex was taken in, and the doors closed. The waiting area felt too bright, too clean for the weight it held. Emma sat, hands clasped, mind replaying the hiss of air the moment numbers turned. She thought of rules and why they existed, of how easily they bent under fear. Ethan stood nearby, back to the wall, gaze outward, the quiet guardian even without his dog. Minutes later, Laura returned alone. She sat across from Emma, posture relaxed now that urgency had passed. You'll be written up, she said plainly. Emma's heart dipped. And commended. Laura continued. Both things can be true. Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Surgery went long but clean. When Rex emerged bandaged and drowsy tail thumping weakly at Ethan's voice, the night exhaled. Laura closed her notebook for the last time that shift. We're not done, she said to Ethan and Emma alike. But tonight we did the right thing. Somewhere beyond, the glass rain softened to a whisper, as if Seattle had decided to keep their secret a little longer. Morning edged into Rainier Harbor Medical Center on wet shoes, pale light sliding along polished floors and finding corners no one had swept with care. The ER had calmed to a low, wary thrum, the kind that followed storms when everyone pretended nothing permanent had shifted. Rex slept in recovery, bandaged and breathing evenly, his sable coat dulled to charcoal beneath sterile sheets, chest rising with the steady assurance of a soldier finally allowed to rest. Ethan Carter stood nearby, back to the wall, by habit, arms crossed, not to close himself off, but to keep still, eyes cataloging the small movements of a place that had revealed too much. Emma Collins returned to work with a clipboard heavier than paper, her shoulders squared by resolve rather than sleep. The adrenaline had drained, leaving behind a clean ache and a sharper sense of responsibility. Deputy Director Laura Bennett arrived early. Raincoat exchanged for a tailored navy blazer that matched the restraint of her voice. She moved through the department with a slim tablet tucked to her side, olive skin catching the light, slate eyes measuring processes rather than people. When she stopped at the supply alcove, she wasn't looking for culprits. She was listening for patterns. Sarah Whitman joined her, tall and spare, sun-blonde hair pulled back scar pale against her collarbone. Sarah's calm had the texture of lived experience, the kind that didn't announce itself. The logs don't line up, Sarah said quietly, pointing out overlapping initials and timestamps that violated the rhythm of a night shift. Laura nodded once, filing it away. The audit unfolded without sirens. Medication counts were reconciled, access badges cross-checked, camera angles reviewed for what they captured and what they didn't. Laura called in help, not from administration, but from compliance, a deliberate choice. By mid-morning, a new figure stepped onto the floor. Thomas Reed, late 50s, compact and unassuming, with iron-gray hair trimmed short and wire-rimmed glasses perched low on a nose that had learned to read footnotes before faces. He wore a rumpled suit, like armor against distraction, and spoke softly, choosing words that made people lean closer. Years earlier, a whistleblower case had cost him a promotion and taught him that patience outlasted power. "We'll start with procurement," he said, voice mild. "Follow the money and the silence breaks." Dr. Ryan Mercer hovered at the margins, jaw tight beneath his immaculate beard, confidence frayed by last night's rebuke. He watched Emma move between bays, steady, efficient, and the sight unsettled him. His anger had cooled into calculation. When Laura asked for his documentation, he complied quickly, too quickly, eager to appear cooperative. Thomas noticed the eagerness and made a note. Ethan remained where he was, a witness rather than a participant, until Laura asked him to walk. They paced the corridor, the hospital's hum filling the spaces between words. "You're careful," Laura said, not looking at him. "People who've been burned usually are." "I don't like attention," Ethan replied. "That's not the same as avoiding truth," she said, stopping at a window that looked down on the loading dock. Below, deliveries arrived on schedule boxes, moving like chess pieces. "Last night's patient wasn't an accident," she added. It wasn't a question. Ethan's jaw tightened. He remembered the ferry manifest, the escort's eyes, the way the man's breathing had fought itself. "Someone wanted him quiet," he said. Laura nodded, satisfied. "And someone used a hospital's noise to try." The truth surfaced in increments. Thomas traced a vendor contract amended 3 times in 6 months, each change shaving oversight in the name of efficiency. Sarah recalled a late delivery accepted without verification. Emma found a discrepancy between administered doses and billed inventory. A small gap repeated often enough to matter. None of it screamed. Together it sang. In recovery, Rex stirred amber eyes, opening to find Ethan's face. The dog's tail thumped weakly approval without ceremony. Ethan leaned in, resting his forehead briefly against Rex's, a private ritual learned under different skies. "Easy," he murmured. The bond steadied him as much as it ever had. Laura convened a brief huddle in an empty consult room. Emma, Sarah, Thomas, and a security supervisor stood while Mercer lingered outside, excluded by design. Laura laid out the findings in clipped sentences, no accusations yet, only implications. "We're instituting a hold on the suspect vendor," she said. "Security logs are locked. IT will mirror systems. No leaks." She met Emma's gaze. "You did what the system needed before it could admit it." Emma swallowed. Praise made her uneasy. Accountability did not. "What happens to him?" she asked, meaning Mercer without naming him. "What should happen?" Laura said, "will." The patient from the ferry stabilized, further imaging, clear vitals. Calm. Mark Hale checked in once, gratitude measured eyes scanning exits as habit demanded. "He'll make it," he said to Ethan, then to Emma. "Because you didn't wait." By afternoon, the audit's outline was clear enough to act. Laura authorized a temporary suspension of the vendor contract and initiated a formal inquiry. Thomas prepared a memo that would move quietly upward, its language precise, its reach long. Mercer was called to administration, not dismissed, not exonerated, placed in limbo, where reputations learned humility. As the day thinned, Emma walked past the bronze plaque near the elevators and felt the building shift from adversary to witness. She paused at Rex's bed one last time, fingers brushing the edge of the sheet, offering a promise without words. Ethan thanked her again, simply, then stopped himself from saying more. Some debts were better honored by action later. Laura watched them from the corridor, rain tapping the glass in a gentler rhythm. "We'll need you," she said to Ethan. Not a command, an invitation, weighted with consequence. Ethan considered Rex sleeping and the city beyond the window. "I'll be around," he said. The night had tried to bury truth under noise. Morning had found it anyway, traced in quiet ink across ledgers and lives, setting the stage for reckonings that preferred the dark, but would not be allowed it. The rain returned with purpose that evening. Not the patient drizzle Seattle wore like a habit, but a hard, slanting downpour that rattled the windows and pressed the city into sharper focus. In recovery, Rex woke to the sound, first ears lifting beneath the bandage, amber eyes brightening as if the weather had spoken a language he understood. He was 4 years old and built lean for endurance rather than bulk. Sable fur darkened to near black along his spine, scars hidden beneath the coat where shrapnel and training had both left their marks. Pain tugged at his hind leg when he shifted, but discipline held. He did not whine. Ethan Carter noticed the change immediately. He stood from the chair by the wall, always the wall, his posture, tall, squared by years of carrying rucks and consequences. Beard trimmed close scar along his jaw, catching the fluorescent light. The storm tightened something behind his eyes. Storms did that. Laura Bennett moved through the department with a different cadence now, urgency layered beneath restraint. She stopped at a workstation where Thomas Reed reviewed mirrored logs, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting columns of numbers that told a story if you let them. The vendor froze, Thomas said softly. Too quickly. He was late 50s, compact hair, iron gray mouth, set in a line that had learned patience after a whistleblower case cost him a promotion and saved a lot of strangers. Laura nodded. And the escort, Mark Hale, appeared as if summoned, jacket, damp at the shoulders, crow's feet deepening as he squinted against the glare. Early 40s, broad and compact, former Marine written into his stance. He woke, Mark said. Asked for a name. Emma Collins paused, mid-chart green eyes lifting. Who's yours? Mark said, then added, and his. They found the patient in a quiet room away from the corridor's churn. He looked smaller without the chaos around him. Dark hair clipped close, beard, regulation, neat cheekbones, sharp under pallor. His breathing was even now, pain-controlled eyes, alert with the particular focus of someone trained to inventory threats before comforts. I need to tell you something, he said, voice hoarse but steady. I'm not supposed to be here. Laura closed the door. Start at the part where the storm matters, she said. The man's name was Daniel Brooks, late 30s logistics officer turned reluctant courier. He described the ferry not as an accident but as a corridor noise to mask a transfer. The data he carried wasn't on a drive. It was printed in his head and stitched into a thin polymer strip woven into his jacket, lining a redundancy born of mistrust. He spoke carefully, every word weighed. They wanted a hospital, he said. Somewhere loud. Somewhere mistakes disappear. Ethan listened without interrupting, recognizing the pattern of a plan that used civility as cover. Emma felt a cold clarity settle over her. Hospitals were sanctuaries by agreement, not immunity. A new presence filled the doorway. Captain Michael Rowan, mid-40s, tall and narrow-shouldered, salt and pepper hair, cut close eyes, pale blue and unsettlingly calm. He wore a civilian coat that didn't quite hide the squared angles of command. A burn scar traced his left forearm, pale and ropey, the souvenir of a vehicle fire years earlier that had taught him the price of hesitation. We're out of time, he said without preamble. They'll try again. Laura studied him. Your authority. Rowan met her gaze. Borrowed, he said. Earned earlier. Outside, the storm intensified, rain drumming like a countdown. Security called in a report, an unmarked delivery truck circling the loading dock twice, then idling where cameras blinked. Thomas's fingers flew. They're testing, he murmured. Rex rose from the bed, careful with the injured leg, nose lifting as if scent rode the rain. A low sound gathered in his chest, not a growl, not fear, but recognition. Ethan's hand hovered, then rested on Rex's collar, grounding both of them. He smells oil, Ethan said quietly. Old diesel. Sarah Whitman stepped in, tall and spare blonde hair, pulled tight scar along her collarbone, stark against scrub blue. We've got a gap, she said. Night shift overlap. Someone signed in twice. Her voice held the steadiness of a woman who'd learned to move through wreckage without flinching. Laura made a decision. We move Brooks, she said. Now. Quiet. The hallway lights dimmed under emergency mode as thunder cracked close enough to vibrate the floor. The team moved with purpose, Emma at the head, eyes forward. Ethan flanking with Rex, who walked heel-perfect despite pain. Rowan and Mark covering angles. They turned a corner and found him just one man, which made him more dangerous. He was lean, early 30s, hood up, beard patchy, and unkempt eyes too bright. He held a badge that almost passed. Almost. Lost, he said, smile thin. Rex stopped. His hackles rose a fraction enough. Ethan felt the dog's weight shift. Back, Ethan said softly. Rex obeyed, then sat blocking the corridor like a statement. The man's hand drifted toward his jacket. Rowan moved first, fast and clean, pinning the wrist. The man resisted with the panicked strength of someone who'd practiced in gyms, not storms. He went down hard, the sound swallowed by thunder. Mark secured him, breath steady. It was over as quickly as it began. Laura exhaled once. Emma's hands trembled after just a little. She noticed and steadied them against the wall, naming facts until the feeling passed. Brooks was moved to a safer room. The storm broke rain, easing as if satisfied. Rex leaned into Ethan's tail, thumping once job done. Ethan felt the shift too, the moment when a path chose you back. Later, Laura stood with Ethan by the window. "They'll escalate," she said. "I know," he replied. She nodded. "So will we." The night had chosen a name for what it was, not an accident, not a test, but a hunt. And hunts, Ethan knew, ended only one way: when the truth stopped running. Dawn crept over Seattle like a careful apology, the storm having spent itself some time before morning, leaving the city washed and raw. Inside Rainier Harbor Medical Center, exhaustion settled into bones and corners, the kind that came after choosing motion over fear. Ethan Carter hadn't slept. He stood at the end of the recovery hall, back to the window now instead of the wall, watching the first ferries cut pale lines through the gray water. Rex lay on a low mat nearby, bandaged leg, elevated ears twitching at every distant sound, 4 years old and already carrying the quiet gravity of a veteran who knew rest was temporary. Laura Bennett convened the room just after shift change. The conference space was spare and unforgiving, glass walls exposing everyone to passing glances. She stood at the head of the table, navy blazer, crisp olive skin drawn tight by a night without sleep, slate eyes steady. Around the table sat Emma Collins, posture straight despite the ache in her shoulders. Sarah Whitman, tall and angular, blonde hair pulled back, scar at her collarbone, a pale reminder of why she never wasted breath. Thomas Reed, wire-rimmed glasses, fogged slightly, iron gray hair, rumpled from hours hunched over data. Captain Michael Rowan, narrow-shouldered and erect, burn scar faint against his forearm, and Mark Hale, compact and solid, standing rather than sitting by habit. Laura didn't begin with names. She began with a map projected onto the glass roots vendors' timestamps. "They underestimated us," she said quietly. "They assumed hospitals looked the other way." She tapped the table once. "They were wrong." Thomas cleared his throat. "The vendor has ties to 3 shell companies," he said. "All legitimate on paper, all quiet." He spoke gently, a man who knew outrage wasted time. "But there's pressure now. They'll move to erase traces." Emma listened, fingers interlaced. The weight she felt wasn't fear, it was consequence. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and she knew better than to regret it. When Laura asked for her assessment, Emma spoke plainly about risk to patients, about the thin line between care and complicity. "If we pretend we didn't see it," she said, "we teach them how to do it again." Rowan nodded once. "Standing still gets people killed," he said. His voice was calm, but something hardened beneath it, a man shaped by a moment years ago when a delay had turned fire into loss. The decision came without ceremony. Brooks would be moved off-site at first light under controlled conditions. The inquiry would proceed publicly enough to deter, quietly enough to protect patients. Mercer would remain sidelined pending findings. Laura assigned roles with precision, not authority for authority's sake. As the meeting broke, a new presence hovered in the doorway, a woman in her early 50s, medium height, sturdy rather than soft, with iron dark hair, streaked white at the temples, and skin weathered by years of night shifts. Her eyes were warm brown, watchful, the kind that noticed people before procedures. "Martha Alvarez," she said, offering a hand to Emma. "Facilities." Her grip was firm. She had lost a nephew to an overdose years back and never forgot how easily systems failed the quiet. "Your dog saved us some trouble," she added, nodding to Rex. Rex lifted his head at the sound of his name-tail tapping once. Ethan smiled despite himself. The transfer unfolded in the muted hour before the city woke. Brooks moved without drama, bundled and anonymous, escorted by Mark and Rowan. No sirens, no headlines, just competence. Ethan walked the perimeter senses, tuned Rex at heel, the dog's limp barely noticeable now that pain was managed. Emma watched them go, a hollow opening in her chest she named relief. Later, Laura found Ethan near the elevators. "You can walk away," she said. He met her gaze. "So can you." She considered him the scar at his jaw, the steadiness that came from a life lived on edges. "I won't," she said. The inquiry rippled outward. Staff whispered less and watched more. A junior resident confessed a shortcut taken months ago. Thomas listened, recorded, didn't judge. Sarah trained a new nurse with patience, sharpened by honesty. Emma returned to triage, her presence altering the room not by volume, but by gravity. Patients noticed. So did administrators. Mercer cracked last. He called Laura into his office late afternoon, face-drawn beard shadowed by regret or calculation, perhaps both. He spoke of pressure, of expectations, of how quickly excellence slid into arrogance. Laura listened unmoved. "Intent matters," she said. "So do outcomes." She left him with the quiet knowledge that some careers bent and others broke. As evening settled, Rex took his first careful steps without assistance, the bandage held. Ethan knelt, murmuring praise that was more promise than comfort. The dog's eyes shone loyalty uncomplicated by fear. Emma joined them, holding 2 cups of coffee, gone lukewarm. She offered one to Ethan. For when standing still costs too much, she said, a wry half-smile ghosting her lips. He accepted it. "You did good," he said simply. She nodded. Praise still unsettled her, but she was learning to accept truth in small sips. The city outside resumed its rhythm. Ferries docked. Rain clouds thinned. Inside, the hospital lines had been drawn not in chalk to be washed away, but in quiet ink that held. Standing still had almost been the easier choice. They had paid more to move. And as Ethan watched Rex breathe steady and alive, he knew the cost had been worth it. Sunlight arrived without drama, slipping between Seattle's clouds and resting on Rainier Harbor Medical Center like a promise kept. The city moved again. Ferries hummed, coffee shops opened. Rain jackets were folded and forgotten, and inside the hospital, the aftershocks of the loud night settled into something gentler. Not silence, understanding. Rex walked the corridor on his own 4 feet for the first time since surgery, bandage-clean gait, careful but confident. He was 4 years old and built for endurance rather than show sable coat, catching warm highlights now that pain no longer demanded all his attention. His ears tracked the world with a softened vigilance, tail-level eyes bright. Ethan Carter matched his pace, tall and steady beard, trimmed close the scar at his jaw, no longer a warning so much as a history. He had slept at last, not long, but enough to loosen the knot behind his eyes. Storms still lived there. They always would, but they no longer owned the room. Emma Collins stood at triage posture, relaxed into competence. She had changed nothing outwardly. Same practical bun, same pale freckled skin, same green eyes that listened first. But something inside her had shifted from apology to presence. Patients felt it. They leaned closer, spoke truer. When a frightened child clutched her sleeve, Emma knelt without thinking, voice low and calm, teaching a breath by breathing it herself. Laura Bennett watched from the mezzanine slate, eyes softening at the edges. She wore authority like a tool rather than armor. Now navy blazer traded for a lighter jacket, olive skin warmed by the sun. The inquiry had concluded with clarity rather than spectacle. The vendor contracts terminated procurement, rebuilt with oversight logs, corrected a report that named failures without needing villains. Dr. Ryan Mercer had resigned 2 days earlier, a quiet letter delivered without bitterness. He would land somewhere else, Laura knew. The hope lay not in exile, but in lessons learned by those who stayed. Sarah Whitman crossed the floor with her long, economical stride, blonde hair, loose today scar at her collarbone catching the light. She had taken on mentoring without fanfare, her calm presence teaching younger nurses how to be precise without becoming hard. The accident that once taught her fragility had also given her patience. She spent it generously now. In facilities, Martha Alvarez oversaw a small ceremony that wasn't a ceremony at all, just a plaque mounted near the elevators where people passed without stopping unless they chose to. It was bronze and simple. It didn't name donors. It named a principle. Actions matter. Martha's iron-dark hair was pulled back, weathered hands steady as she tightened the last screw. She thought of her nephew and felt finally a measure of peace. The day Daniel Brooks left the city, no one watched. That was the point. Mark Hale and Captain Michael Rowan escorted him to a quiet dock where a gray boat waited without insignia. Brooks shook hands once gratitude measured. "You didn't wait," he said to Emma and Ethan. "That's the difference." He left with the data safe and the past catching up to those who had tried to hide it. Later, Laura found Ethan by the window overlooking the water. "You could stay," she said, not as an offer of control but of belonging. Ethan considered Rex, who had settled into a patch of sun eyes, half-lidded, breathing easy. He considered Emma at triage, Sarah teaching the hospital breathing in a new rhythm. "I will," he said. "For a while." Laura smiled, small and genuine. "That's enough." They held the adoption paperwork in a quiet office with a plant that leaned toward the light. It felt absurd and right at the same time. Ethan signed without flourish, hand steady. Rex pressed his head into Ethan's knee, a familiar weight anchoring the present. When the clerk, a young woman with ink-stained fingers and a kind smile, slid the certificate across the desk, Ethan felt a chapter close, not with a slam, but with a click. Emma joined them outside, coffee in hand, sunlight warming her face. "He'll need a yard," she said, glancing at Rex. "He'll get one," Ethan replied. She hesitated, then smiled. "I know a place." They drove north that evening, city thinning into trees, air sharpening with salt and pine. The house was modest, weathered cedar, and wide windows perched where the water widened and the world slowed. Emma's aunt had lived there once. The space had been waiting. Rex explored carefully, nose-mapping stories, then chose a spot by the window and lay down with a sigh that sounded like permission. As the sun sank, they sat on the porch steps, shoulders touching not by accident. Ethan spoke of Kandahar once briefly, the words placed carefully as stones across water. Emma listened without fixing, without fear. When he finished, the quiet held. Inside the hospital, the changes endured. Training sessions emphasized judgment over hierarchy. Procurement adopted transparency as habit. Thomas Reed closed his file and smiled at last, the satisfaction of work that didn't need applause. Laura updated policy with a light hand and a firm pen. Sarah pinned a new schedule that balanced workload and rest. Martha's plaque caught the morning light every day. Weeks later, Rainier Harbor hosted a community open house, no speeches, just doors open and coffee shared. Children met Rex and learned that calm could look like courage. A retired ferry captain shook Emma's hand and said thank you without knowing why it mattered. Ethan stood nearby, no longer the man at the wall, but still aware of exits, a habit softened into care. When night came, it came gently. The storms had moved on or learned new names. Rex slept dreaming, paws twitching. Emma washed dishes, humming something old. Ethan stepped outside and breathed the air clean and unafraid. Hope, he learned, didn't announce itself, it stayed. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire. Sometimes they come quietly through steady hands, loyal hearts, and people who choose compassion when no one is watching. God often works this way, not by breaking the world open, but by stitching it back together through ordinary souls willing to do the right thing. In everyday life, when you show kindness instead of pride, courage instead of silence, love instead of fear, you may be answering a prayer you never heard spoken. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from or what this story meant to you. Your words may be a blessing to another soul. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of faith, courage, and second chances. May God watch over you, protect your loved ones, and fill your days with quiet miracles. Amen.